And welcome to the SumerSports Show with Eric Eager and Thomas Dimitrov. I'm Eric Eager. I'm the VP of Research and Development at SumerSports, joined as always by Thomas Dimitrov, the CEO of SumerSports. This one is only a day early this week, whereas last week we were a few days early. Both of us had unique experiences, right? Because we've been in football. You've been in football, Thomas, far longer than me. But we both got to take trips during the season for the first time in forever. Thomas, you got to go on your honeymoon. I got to go to Lincoln, Nebraska and see my alma mater. Thomas, how was your week? And what was it like to be out of town during a football weekend?
You know, it was great. We were in France. It was awesome being there. Never traveled like that, but my mind, as much as I don't want to admit that to my wife, my mind was back in the US at times thinking about football and what was going on. I want to jump over to you. Were you there clandestinely looking for a new head coach for your alma mater?
That's funny because I got asked to do this set of speeches back when I was working for PFF, and so I agreed to it. It was going to be kind of weird because PFF during the season is a little different than Sumer, so it was going to be I was kind of like, I'll squeeze it in, and then so I gave a talk in front of the university on at the student union one week, and then I gave one to the math departments and another one to a seminar. And I did make a few jokes. I said, look, you've tried, former quarterback Scott Frost played for Nebraska for all those years. You tried former defensive coordinator Bo Pelini. That was the coach when I went there. You tried a Super Bowl head coach who is a all-timer. I mean, after you take out Dante Scarnecchia, is Bill Callahan not the best offensive line coach in league history? You tried him, and the thing that you haven't tried, Nebraska, is a mathematician, and that didn't work, unfortunately. So, all joking aside, no, it was very interesting to sort of see what it was like, and you know how it is, you go somewhere for 4 years, and for me, it was very formidable. I was a young kid when I got there, and by the time I was out, I was married, and we were pregnant with our first kid, and so I feel like I really grew up there. Down to how it smelled, it just kind of took you back, right? And so it's always fun to go to the alma mater and walk around and sort of view your old life with all the knowledge that you ended up gaining after you went there.
Well, look, I mean, the fact that you're able to get back there, do a little bit of work, meet with your old academic advisors. I mean, that was pretty amazing, I'm sure. Getting a chance to have him around, speaking with you. Was he listening last week into our show or something? Was he around?
Well, and he was so clutch because my PhD advisor is not into football at all. His son is into football, which is kind of funny because I landed on Sunday and then we watched NFL Red Zone together, which was an experience for him, but his son really enjoyed that. But he's a musician, so I don't know if anybody noticed, but we had to kind of cut the podcast in the middle and glue it together. And Richard, my academic advisor, he knew exactly how to do that seamlessly because he had worked with music and, files and all that kind of stuff before. So he actually was very clutch for me. But yeah, for the most part, I think he ignored all the football stuff and really just wanted to talk the math and machine learning and all the applied stuff that we do here, which is cool. And SumerSports certainly, has the ear of people as, given how, as much talent as we have here. And just to kind of give people a little bit of a summary, because I know this is only the third episode. If you want to go back and listen to episodes 1 and 2, we'd love for you to. But we're planning on doing this podcast more or less every Wednesday. We're going to keep it to about 45, 50 minutes. Thomas, as everybody knows, is a former NFL GM, twice executive of the year in the NFL. Prior to that, won Super Bowls with New England Patriots as an executive as well, former scout. I was data scientist at PFF. Prior to that, I was a math professor. So I think we come at this. I think both of us are love football, of course. So that's the common denominator. But we come at this with with two different perspectives that I think will be very enriching for this show. And what I'm really excited about, I want to thank everybody so far who's listened, and not only who's listened, but people who have given us some feedback, some criticism as well, which is always warranted as we're trying to make this show the best. But Thomas, I have listener questions. And at SumerSports is the SumerSports Twitter account. I put out a call for people to ask questions. And not often do people get access to a former general manager. And so they were eager, for lack of a better term, to give us questions. And this person who is CDPISTD on Twitter has a picture of CeeDee Lamb, so that's where the CD comes from. What do front offices value the most when scouting offensive linemen during the draft process? I think that this brings up a really cool kind of story because you drafted some linemen in Atlanta, and those linemen are having success this year. What is that like for you to watch a position that, it takes a while for those guys to develop, statistically speaking, and it's a tough position because sometimes these guys have to play right away, and it takes a while for them to mature. What has it been like to watch? And the question, which is, what do you look for when you're drafting O-linemen? And then secondarily, what's it like to see them develop this way?
So let's start. This is a great question. Let's start with the O-lineman, what you look at. A lot of people think you just get big old dudes in there who can just move the pile. I'm a big believer in, and so are many people in the NFL, if you can find an athletic offensive lineman, he could be 6'7" or he could be 6'3", 4. Of course, we don't want to go too short. Mm-hmm. The guys that have the feel and the body control and the ability to have leverage. We used to always look out for those guys that were wrestlers in high school or college, right? There's something about those cats that can get around, move their body, get into a spot, recover, get out on pulls, sit back, drop their hips. They can punch. They have explosiveness. They have just the ability to keep their feet in any kind of trash. So it is athleticism, but it's a little bit of a different type of athleticism. I really folded in on, in the idea of making sure that these guys understand leverage and they understand the ability to get low and bend. Big deal for us in the NFL when we're evaluating O-linemen.
What's when you look at though, like I think that's great. Like the problem sometimes you see it, like for example, the Vikings took Garrett Bradbury in 2019, and like he has that stuff, right? He can move, he can get around, and like you had in Atlanta Alex Mack, which was one of your best free agent signings. But the problem is that's a tough, like early on in your career, you have that athleticism, which I want to ask, like, how do you measure that? Is it just a feel thing? Is it a film thing, or is it somewhat of a numbers based thing with the metrics? But those guys oftentimes, like when I moved from wide receiver to tight end in college, they're like, son, you got to get some lead in your pencil. What happens when those linemen aren't, like, they have all that athleticism, but they're facing some grown men playing nose tackle, three tech. What happens? Like, is that why it's difficult for them to acclimate right away? Because the kind of guys who are big enough to play on offensive linemen in the NFL effectively are often not athletic enough, and the guys who are athletic enough are not necessarily big enough right away.
It's a great point, and I think so everyone doesn't misunderstand what I was saying. It could be that really big, just move the pile type of guy. He still has to have the ability to keep his feet, to have enough body control. It may not be as pretty as some of those guys out there that are 6'4", 295 or 305, and they may be the 350 or 60 guys, but they're guys that have the control. They can still leverage. They can still keep their feet. They have enough quickness about them. So it really depends as well the type of system you're playing. Of course, if you have an outside zone scheme guy, you definitely need those movement guys, but you need the players that are going to keep their feet. You need the players that have, the ability to explode with their hands again. So it's not just pure athleticism. It's a combination of it mixed in with the size and the strength that they have. So it is really interesting. Let me just say this though, which is really interesting as well, Eric. You were talking about, I look back on the Falcons right now, and they're playing some pretty good offensive line football right now. Arthur Smith is a really good football coach. He comes with an O-line background, right? Tight end O-line. He has a really good understanding of that, and I think he's doing a really good job, as well as their O-line coach is here, with guys like, Jake Matthews has been there a long time, of course. You have Chris Lindstrom, who I think is one of the best guards out there. I love the way that he plays. He's the epitome of that O-lineman who can move around like he can, runs a 4.75, and will just blow people up because he's so explosive and strong. And honestly, Caleb McGarry's been playing well on the outside. It's fun to watch those guys. But I've been on the other side. Remember, when we traded away all of our picks, everyone wants to hit me on that, of course, with Julio Jones. And we actually gave away the first round pick the next year. So the first pick that we had the following year from Julio Jones was Peter Kahns. Peter Kahns was a really good football player in Wisconsin. I raised my hand. As much as I love him, he was one of my most failed picks, unfortunately, because he just didn't, come to play for the rest of his career, and was really unfortunate. And we missed on him. And there maybe are many reasons you miss on a low lineman, but it is really important for you to understand when you do miss on the O lineman, Eric, that you take inventory of it and you don't do it again. And we could get into that another time, of course.
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? Because you think about the boxes, right? Played at Wisconsin, right? Like there's not a lot of guys that play at Wisconsin that fail at O-line, and you bring up the great point of, some guys just between, and not to talk disparagingly about anybody, but some guys between the ears are just different. They're different cats. And like, you get to where you are, your high school player, your college player. Oftentimes you're so much better than the players you play with that all this stuff in between the ears doesn't really matter. And then you get up to the NFL where everything's just a little bit more fair, right? Physically. And it does depend upon how good you are mentally. And I think for offensive line, speaking as somebody who played wide out in high school and then played tight end, like the offensive line game from a cerebral standpoint is just a different game than any other position other than quarterback. And you have the difficulty, I think, physically adjusting, right? And we'll, a different podcast, we'll talk about tight end because I think it has a couple aspects of it. But like you're learning not only the schemes, which are far more, I would say immaculate and intricate than they are in college, but you're also learning how to anchor against, some of the premier athletes in the world, which are three techs and defensive ends and things like that, which are the athletic mismatch between that side of the ball and the O-line and the other side of the ball, the D-line. It's too big, right? And so it's very hard to adjust there. When you look, and I think that you hit the nail on the head too. It's like when you make a trade like the one for Julio, right? Julio's a 10 out of 10, right? He ended up being a 10 out of 10, right? But the downstream thing is because you don't have the 12 draft picks now the next year, you have 3 or 4 or 6 or something like that. At weak link systems like O-line only goes as its weakest member. And I think that that's why you're seeing a lot of offenses struggle this year. It doesn't really matter if you have Tyron Smith, if the other 4 guys stink. If a guy doesn't pan out along the offensive line, it hurts you so much more than maybe if a guy doesn't pan out, even like at a position like running back or linebacker or something like that. Offensive line, it's like all 5 guys have to be good. And unfortunately, when a guy fails, defenses can attack that position.
Let's stay on a line here because it's fascinating. As much as I love the athletic positions moving around the field, and I know where the money is that way. I get that. Of course, the money is in O-line as well. Let's talk about this for a minute. When I look back on that mistake that I made with Peter Kahns and we made, but ultimately I was at the trigger point. What the mistake that was really made, beside the fact that we were going after an O-lineman, our second pick, the first pick in the second round that year, we also were ready to move on from Todd McClure. And we brought in this center thinking that he was going to be the heir apparent to Todd. Todd was a really good football player. He was at the tail end of his career. I came in and I was in my early years, of course, still early years from being in the Patriot paradigm. And I always marveled watching Bill Belichick make the moves before it was too late, right? Mm-hmm. He was magical, I always thought, on making sure that he didn't waste another contract on a player that really didn't have it in him to play for the duration of the contract. I thought we would bring in move along from Todd McClure, bring in Peter Kahns. Matt Ryan could grow with them, and they would grow for 7, 8, 10 years. It just did not work. In the end, Todd McClure should have played another 2 years for us, and maybe the transition would have been easier for Peter Kahns. And remember, the way the rules are right now, and you can opine on this, they do not develop the way they used to. They're not as quick to develop because they just can't. The rules on the field in practice, you don't have the physicality. You don't learn how it is to truly get your feet up underneath you and get ready to go on and play, because rules are very different in today's practices, of course.
Well, absolutely. And that's the thing. Like, and my last year was '07, and I can still remember days when we were in shells or days where we were just helmets. And you're just like, oh gosh, this is just this is an easy day. Just catch the balls that are thrown to you. Don't make mistakes mentally. But there is a physical aspect of it. And one of the cool comments that I got repeatedly about the last show was our discussion of practice squads and how it evolved from a 4-man practice squad in the 90s to 8-ish in the aughts, and then now it's 16. But those 16 are oftentimes comprised of players who already have that, right? They're just over the hill, and they're just there because that they can run the drills. Whereas the player development part, and I kind of call it a potato chip league at some point, right? Where if you just think about quarterback is probably the easiest one, but if you failed 10 years ago, if you failed on, or actually it's more like 15 years ago, if you failed on a first-round quarterback, going up and picking first meant that you were paying Sam Bradford $50 million guaranteed right from the jump. Whereas, the Jets fail on Sam Darnold, they go right back in with Zach Wilson. Zach Wilson's cheap. They can build a bunch of players around him, and they're 4-2. And there really isn't an incentive, right? Like, I think about a guy like Tony Romo, right? Undrafted out of one of the directional Illinois schools, right? And they stashed him because they had Bledsoe and Henson and guys like that. And if either one of those guys failed, they didn't want to go back in the draft and pay an unpaid guy $50 million or unknown guy $50 million. They wanted to kind of get Romo, develop him. He turns out great. His first contract, Aaron Rodgers' first contract, were all below market deals because they were guys that teams took a chance on and developed. Nowadays in the NFL, with the first round picks have the 5th-year option. That's not that cheap anymore. And just the incentives, in addition to the practice stuff that you're talking about, it's just not there right now for teams to develop. And I want to, not to give away the game here, but I do think that a huge edge for NFL teams is going to be to buck that trend, is to somehow figure out, like the NBA has, right? Where guys who were set, like Brook Lopez was a 7-foot center, didn't take a 3 for the first 8 years of his career. Now he's like a proficient 3-point shooter, adjusting with the game. In the NFL, I think the team that cracks development is going to win quite a bit. And that, to your point, like that's how the Patriots were, back in the day. It's just like they're responding to incentives, but I think that they've overcorrected in the NFL.
Well, look, when you talk about development, Eric, okay, it could be, in practice squad, it could be your young players, develop. If you have a head coach, and we're going to move into a really interesting conversation here, but your head coach in today's NFL, that coach must be a developing head coach. He will not last long in this league if he's not. If he can't take his talent and develop along with his coaching staff. And by the way, it is up to the head coach to hire his staff. And if he has a whole bunch of loyal myrmidons around him and they're not good developers, but he likes them around them just because they're his guys, everyone's going to be short-lived, including the general manager. Believe me, it needs to be focused on development. You have to have a head coach in today's world that is willing to play the young guys, willing to put them out there and get his feet wet. I mean, that is a big deal in today's world, so that you can play them for years and years. If you're playing that old game like John Gruden used to play, he wanted all veterans out there. John was a very good coach. We know that. People will argue whatever they want to argue about him, but he did not like the young guys. You need coaches in today's world that are going to play and develop. They're going to put them on the field in the practice. They're going to put them in spots that are real life spots, situational spots, to make them as good as they can be so that you can grow with them for years to come.
Well, and especially, and we'll get, that's a good segue to what we're talking about now, which is like the news of the week, right? Which is the Carolina Panthers, who have recently, let go Matt Rule, former coach of Temple, a team that he, made into not a contender, but a bowl team, and Baylor, a team that he made into a true contender. He gets a long-term deal. There was a bidding war for him between the Giants reportedly and then Carolina. He gets the big deal. He gets a long guaranteed deal, which, to your point, Thomas, where if anybody's going to have the chance to develop a team, right, with some true backing from ownership, it was going to be Matt Rule. He's going to be paid $40 million over the next few years not to coach for the Panthers. He gets hired, and I think that this maybe is what could make somebody with your background bristle a little bit. He was hired before the general manager was figured out there in Carolina, right? So there wasn't synergy there at the very beginning. But he ends up, instead of sort of building it up from the studs, right? Instead of drafting a young quarterback, building around him, developing, he goes right to Teddy Bridgewater, who's a good quarterback. But interesting, Teddy Bridgewater in year one for Carolina was making twice as much as Joe Burrow, the first pick in that draft. And he gets a lot of guys that played with him at Temple, played with him at Baylor. Robbie Anderson, a classic example, now shipped out to Arizona yesterday with the trade. But like, when you see that situation and you're thinking to yourself, okay, it's clear a lot of things went wrong there. But do you think, Thomas, like the biggest one was, like you, when you started out, you had Mike Smith that started out right with you, right? And you guys built that thing. You had a few 12-win seasons, and you built that thing up from the ground up. Like, there wasn't synergy there. There really wasn't a coherent plan. And unfortunately, no one gets to see their plans work out because it just didn't look like the thing was gelling from the very beginning. And it's unfortunate to see that happen to a couple guys' careers.
So first of all, wow, I could talk forever about this topic because it is such a hot topic in the league. And having been on hot seats for many, many years, this league is full of hot. I don't care where you are and how good you are in this league. You're going to be on the hot. You're going to be off the hot. You're going to be on the hot. That's just how it is. Matt Rule, he is a very good football coach. Collegiately, he did a great job. But you and I both know the record of collegiate coaches coming into the NFL and thriving. We know what that is. You also have a man like David Tepper, who is a fantastic businessman. I mean, our founder and chairman of the board, Paul Tudor Jones, is close with David Tepper, and he raves about the ability that David Tepper has as far as a businessman. And obviously, business is business. He comes into this situation, and it's not always that easy. I'm sure he feels that he's got it down because he understands business. But there are nuances in the NFL that I think are really, really interesting when you look at it. You, as an owner, you have to come in. You have to listen to a lot of people around you. You can't just go off of what you're reading in the media, of course. In no way am I insinuating that Mr. Tepper did that. I'm just saying he had been around football. He had been around the Steelers, right? What was his situation with the Steelers for a little bit of time? I think he was a limited partner. Yeah, limited partner. But he had been around football, and he's a tough guy. He's to the core. My point is, you go after a guy like Matt Rule, who had a really good reputation for taking teams and doing things with them, of course. Now you're in a situation where, and by the way, look, Matt Rule was one of those guys that was a really highly recruited coach. That's another thing that I want to talk about when the time is right. Owners in this league, there's a lot going on right now. They get caught up in the bidding wars. I mean, Arthur had gotten caught up in the bidding wars with us, with Dan Quinn. Luckily, we got him, of course. Owners don't like to lose those bidding wars. You know that. I mean, in the end, David Tepper ends up paying Matt Rule, I think, $7.8 million APY in his first contract. That is huge money in the NFL. So all that aside, and all that to say, now as an organization, they're in a spot where they have to make some big decisions. Scott Fitterer, really good football man, basis as a scout, right at the core. He's a hardworking, charging evaluator at the core is what he is. And now he has an opportunity to be given the keys, I'm sure, and to decide how he's going to work with Steve Wilkes. Let's see how that goes, right? And if it's not that, how he's going to work with the next head coach, because there's no doubt in my mind that a guy like Scott Fitterer deserves an opportunity to make that coaching call along with his owner, of course. They both, again, are smart football people, or smart people, both in their own businesses, and pick the next coach or stay with Coach Wilkes. That will be interesting to see how that goes. And let me just say this. I've been there. You're in that situation. Your organization, there's so much going on. A lot of people wondering what direction it's going, who's going to last, who's going to survive, who's going to move on. And that becomes a little bit hairy within an organization. And it will be up to Scott Fitterer to mellow the people out and let them believe and not, get everyone uptight, which is not Scott's way as it is, as you know, people in Carolina.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's like, yeah, and You had the opportunity, obviously, you had Mike Smith, who was a very successful coach in Atlanta, especially relative to early expectations for you guys. And then, things fell off and you had to let him go, and you go with Dan Quinn, and Quinn kind of right from the beginning, I think actually, probably good. You start out 5-0 in 15, you go 8-8, probably best to go 8-8 right away. And then, kind of you grow into the expectations in 16, which ended up being a Super Bowl appearance. With Fitterer, it's kind of weird, right? Because that hire for that general manager spot very much was consulted by Matt Rule. And I think like that's really difficult from your perspective. Like that is a hard thing unless that head coach has some cachet. You're talking about a Belichick or a Tomlin or, somebody who has won a Super Bowl or generates a lot of respect. It's really hard because when you're Fitterer coming out of it, it's like, okay, now a guy who advocated for me to come in is now gone. You really have to, generate some goodwill there. And to, the next point, which is they have to start with Robbie Anderson already, but now with Christian McCaffrey and Brian Burns and, guys who are good football players for that team, they have to start sort of thinking about whether or not they want to be sellers at the trade deadline, which is November 1st, or whether they want to keep these guys and work around them salary cap wise without what is a reasonable option for them at quarterback moving forward. Like how difficult of a position is he in, and how you took over an Atlanta team that was in a bad place. Like how much of other people's mistakes before you do you have to deal with, and how many of them do you have to own, and how many of them are you able to write off with the ownership blessing?
It's a great question. You actually have to own them all. You understand that the media might be popping off, or the fan base may be saying, "Oh, those weren't Scott's deals." Scott Fitterer, I'm talking about. But Scott, he's a man's man. Scott's going to take it on. He knows that he has to lead this organization out of what's going on right now, and he can't, of course, ever point fingers. He's got to be able to sit down with his owner. David Tepper and Scott Fitterer will sit down and discuss every direction of this organization moving forward. And it can't be in any way, quite honestly, throwing darts at, a classy guy like Matt Rule. It's about, what do we do now? Let's put it behind us. Let's figure out, are there trade situations here that are going to benefit this football team for not only the rest of the season, but for years to come, hopefully. And again, these are not easy decisions to make because, you want, there's a marketing side and the fan base side. The fan base doesn't want to see you dealing away some of your best players. They might want you to, do well in the draft and have, positions that are upgraded, of course, but it's not easy for the fan base to see you doling out opportunities to trade people when they're players that are some of the fan favorites. So there are so many nuances to it, Eric, that become complicated when you're sitting in that seat, GM and owner right now, post firing. And then you have that new head coach that's in the interim setting. How do you manage that? How do the players see you managing that? Again, this is never easy to be fired. What was after the first quarter of the season? It rarely happens with the GMs. Like when that happened with me a couple of years ago, that's rare. Normally it might be the head coach and then everyone settles in and starts doing their thing. Thank God for Scott Fitterer, and I wasn't expecting anything but that. He gets an opportunity to take this and move forward, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, for sure. And they're left with kind of my next thing, which is, this idea of positional value, right? So I know folks like me who are, run the numbers, right? I made PFF War which talks about positional value and that kind of thing. And, it's a big discussion about running backs versus other positions, but they're running into it right now, right? Christian McCaffrey, who, I think you can relate to because you guys had Julio Jones. He was at a premium position, but he was very much the face of the franchise to some degree, along with Matt Ryan when you were in Atlanta. Christian McCaffrey, firmly the face of this Panthers franchise, but he plays one of the least valuable positions in football and running back, and yet he's getting paid top of the market value for him. And so it's really tough because, to trade him would be I think it would not look good to the fan base. But at the same time, he's also, because of injuries and just the way the impact the position has, which is, if you don't have a great O-line and you don't have a great quarterback, the running back can only help you so much. Mm-hmm. trading him is going to be incredibly difficult for them unless they're willing to take a lot less in compensation. Whereas somebody like Brian Burns, who's plays defensive end, he's like a top 5 guy in terms of pressures by PFF. He's as a Kansas City fan, I'd like the Chiefs to throw a one Carolina's way to get him. It's going to be a lot easier to trade Brian Burns, even though he's not the face of the franchise. He plays a much more valuable position. He's a little bit younger, and he's still on his rookie deal. Can you comment, because I know that, over your time, you invested in Michael Turner, and that was ended up being a great investment. You had Devontae Freeman, you had great running backs. But you also, when you made your signature move, which was the Julio, after Matt Ryan was this Julio Jones, that was for a premium position. Julio Jones was worth multiple wins above replacement as a member of the Falcons, which made that trade ultimately worth it in the end. Can you comment on positional value, what you're sort of thinking about it? Because it's this downstream stuff that I don't think a lot of decision makers are thinking about when they make, the $16 million APY deal for a guy like McCaffrey.
Well, let me first say I'm not and never have been a fan of trading in season. Again, there are many layers to that. Usually, not always, it's changed a little bit, but it used to be where those guys that were leaving your organization or were up for trading were just full of baggage, right? There were character issues coming out of their ears that you just didn't want to deal with it. You had to have the right situation when you went about it. I wasn't a fan of moving people from our own organization as well, because there's something about the building and how people were together during those important times. Obviously, there are certain times you have to make that move. I would say, there are certain positions that you and I have talked about as well that you're more apt to find in free agency. And you can opine on that as well, because I know you have the stats with it. There could be 3 or 4 of those positions that, come hell or high water, you're going to have an opportunity to get one of those positions in free agency. And maybe don't necessarily waste your booty on it in the draft, right? So before I toss it over to you in this way, it was really big for me. Every time I went into the draft and free agency in the draft, I wanted to be able to know that I could, basically lop off 1, 2, or 3 moves in free agency. So I didn't have to rely heavily on everything in the draft with so much precariousness. Like, how am I going to get 7 needed positions? If I could pull off 1, 2, or 3, usually 2 or 3, it was a much better situation to go in the draft to be able to allow me to move up or potentially move back. And as you know, my name was Trader Thomas, so I didn't move back a whole bunch. I was always moving up. Talk about that a little bit, Eric, because I know you have the statistics on it.
Yeah, for sure. And I talked about Alex Mack, right? So, the definition, and Jason Fitzgerald, who's wonderful at Over the Cap and somebody we certainly respect and use there. He defined it as basically the percentage of top end players at a position that are accessible through free agency. So you think about the top 5 players at quarterback, none of them are accessible through free agency. Brady was a weird case, but for the most part, it's Brady, it's Kirk Cousins, and then every other quarterback you either need to trade for or you need to draft and develop. Right? Wide receivers, the same thing. Like that list of wide receivers last year that were supposed to be free agents, they all got signed or they all got traded for, right? Like you're not getting a free agent wide receiver who's any good, right? You're getting Christian Kirk. And he's good, don't get me wrong, but he's not an elite guy. Whereas you guys, center is not a premium position. So you can access Alex Mack in free agency, and he ends up being sort of your cornerstone player. You can access a defensive tackle oftentimes for free agency. Linebackers, another position. You can access those guys. Slot cornerback, right, is another position. Not valuable position for sure, but Dante Robinson, for example, very valuable player, but you can get him. He's available in free agency. So the positions that you want to get, right, are going to be positions in the top end of the draft that you can't get in free agency. You can draft and develop, and you get a surplus for them. When you draft a Quentin Nelson 6th overall, he's already a top 5 paid player at the position already, right? When you draft him, Saquon Barkley at 2 overall was a top 5 paid player at the position when he was drafted. When you draft one of the Bosas in a top 3 pick, he's already worth on the field what the top guys are making, but at humongous small fraction of the price, right? Quarterback. Justin Herbert, he's not playing as well as he used to, but that guy's worth 40, 50 million on the field. He's making less than 10, right, on the ledger. So you're getting a surplus there. You don't get as big of a surplus when you use that top end dollars on or top end picks on non-premium positions, because those positions aren't paid as much in the marketplace. That's why, Terry Fontenot is, this Falcons team is doing well this year, but it was one of the reasons why, the Kyle Pitts thing was a little bit dicey, because when Kyle Pitts gets drafted at 4th overall, he's already making money that's similar to some of the top end tight ends, whereas Jamar Chase is not. And even though those players are probably equally good, right? Chase is coming in at such a value relative to what you're paying DeAndre Hopkins and Devontae Adams and so on and so forth, whereas Pitts is coming in as less of a difference between him and the, George Kittles and the Travis Kelce's. And so there's just that gap there that doesn't exist when you take a non-premium position.
Which you can talk about Pitts all day long. I mean, he's one of the best of,
already
athletically, right, and what he can do, but you can imagine where the fan base and the local media is on it, because they want him to be thrown to 15 or 20 times. He has that kind of ability. And when he comes away with 3 grabs, of course, I'm sure Arthur Smith's not happy to be dealing with that. He has a plan for it. But again, people want to see their players, their marquee players, as their go-to guys. And they do have some offensive talent there right now in Atlanta. And that's another thing. Of course, I'm always happy for them at certain levels. And I told you earlier, I believe, last 2 years, it was tough. It's a lot easier for me to watch them now because there aren't as many people there. And it doesn't feel like I was no longer invited to the party. It's not my party anymore.
Yeah, very much so. And again, they've made some moves. Obviously they, one of your last draft picks, a tremendous athlete, and Calvin Ridley's not there either. I think it might look different if he was able to play this year. When you got Calvin Ridley in 2018, he was already a good receiver, but then of course he was making $5 million playing like a $20 million receiver. That's a $15 million surplus right away. And it's just extremely difficult to get that in a guard or a center. Not to mention, as we talked about earlier in the podcast, those guys develop later too, right? So you're not wasting, but the cheap years are oftentimes corresponding with cheap play on the field, and then they end up being great at the end, which is its own story. So that makes the whole problem really tough. But I think the rule of thumb that our intuition about what premium positions are, which is quarterback, wide receiver, edge, cornerback, which has become more important now that you have to play 3 at a time. I think is that's a pretty good offensive tackle. I think those, if you stick to those in kind of round 1 and maybe round 2, you're probably going to end up being okay long term. And it's one of the reasons why a GM who I really respect as far as his ability as evaluator, Chris Ballard, almost all of his picks are good players, but maybe why it hasn't worked out quite as much for them, because all of their good players are linebacker, guard, running back. And it's like, well, you got to pay up for a guy like Matt Ryan because he's a premium position. You got to pay up in draft picks and money. And it's like, are you really getting the value there? I know Matt played well on Sunday, but so far it's been a journey for that team to get to where they are. It's just an interesting, and to get your perspective, because you're a guy, like, I think from an evaluator standpoint, it's as fun to evaluate a linebacker as it is to evaluate an offensive tackle. So it's kind of tricky, right? Because you the hits and misses matter the same.
So what I'd like to do, we can whet an appetite here, brother. So we said we're not going to talk a whole bunch about SumerSports right now. We're not trying to be too enigmatic or mysterious. But when we start talking in this league about roster optimization and how wildly important it is, and how the league and data and analytics is like this unbelievable evolution of what's going to happen in this league, not only now, but in the future. When we talk about players like this, at the core, we're talking about evaluating the players. But there are so many levels to doing that, and what algorithms in today's world and what analytics, can provide us is beyond what any of us have ever imagined. Can you talk just a little bit about that as we segue into or out of this without talking too much about SumerSports?
I mean, that's the thing. It's like there's so many things to this, right? Like, so you or a former evaluator, you slap a grade on a player, like you're just supposed to say whether or not this guard is good or not, right? And that has incredible, like if you fail at that, I don't like I could draft all the premium positions in the world, but if you're telling me Christian Ponder's good, right? Then I could take a quarterback wherever, I could take players like him all over the place, and I'm going to say, oh, well, it's a premium position, it's a value, but I'm still going to lose because I'm not taking a great player, right? And that's, part of the Ballard point where he's taking good players at least, right? So they're never going to be that bad, even though I think from a value perspective, it may be a little off. So you have that, right? So you have the problem of evaluating players, and people, Pro Football Focus, my old employer, is doing that. Scouts are doing that. We're working on some algorithms to do that. And then you have the idea of value, which, my former colleague at PFF, Brad Spielberger, did such a good job along with the aforementioned Jason Fitzgerald of like, let's put a value on all these players. And a lot of that takes the on-field value, looking at positional value, and then saying, okay, what's that worth versus what we're paying for it? And then you have this idea of like, okay, let's add all that up and win the most games, right? Let's win the most games. And the hard part is when you take, and most of football analytics to this point has only looked at one dimension at a time. So we're gonna take the best quarterback, right? Well, then it's like, oh, cool. So we're going to sign Kirk Cousins. It's like Kirk Cousins is a good quarterback. And in fact, I think Kirk Cousins has played to a surplus value of 0, which you could do a lot worse than that. He's played up to his contract. The problem is since then, the Minnesota Vikings have signed the biggest free agent signing they've made since then was Michael Pierce, a nose tackle, for 3 years, $27 million. So what we're trying to do at SumerSports is say, okay, you can make the Cousins move, but that move doesn't happen in a vacuum. Downstream, then you're going to know that for the next 3 years, you're going to have to hit on your draft picks because you're not going to be able to do what the New York Yankees do and just outspend your mistakes. And so what happens? Instead of being able to sign an interior offensive lineman like you guys did with Alex Mack, they got to draft Garrett Bradbury. Well, now Garrett Bradbury in year 4 is playing okay football, but you wasted 3 years on him playing like crap. So it's like that's the hard, you have to make one bet, but it's parlayed with all your other bets. And I think at SumerSports, what we're trying to do through optimization is try to give the decision makers full understanding of the gambles that they're making. And I think that is, sort of the value add that no one's really accessed before.
Well, look, we could talk forever about this, I know, and this could make this an hour, 2, 3 hour long. Of course, we have a lot to talk about in the future on it, but I'm, from a bigger perspective, I have a great deal of faith in what the owners are going to be doing in the future in this league. And they know how important it is to make sure that they provide their general manager and their head coach, the team builders, with the right augmentation tools. Let's just call it that. We've said before, whether it was on this pod, the first one, or anytime we've ever discussed it, because you and I have known each other for a number of years now. When I was working at Atlanta, we used to talk about different things, and I had a great deal of respect for you, and you always have had people in this league that respect you for that, to be able to provide the extra information and the augmentation element to these people that are good football people, who are good evaluators, but they know they can't do it on their own. It is not an exact science. And when I come back to saying the owners, I have faith in them, it is up to the owners. It's up to the owners to press their team builders now and say, this is not just you looking me in the eye, general manager or head coach, and saying, it's just in my heart, I feel this. That doesn't fly anymore. It's about taking the data from the data scientists and the data that's available to us at so many levels and be able to apply it appropriately and eliminate some of the haphazard decisions that have been made in this league for many years and will continue to be made until we as the league evolve and understand that there's a better way to do things.
Yeah, being able to go to the owner and say, hey, I made this decision. These were my 3 other options. What, or even before the decision's made, like, here, these are my 4 options. I think this one is the best. Do you think these other ones? And being able to have, somebody else, like, again, I think it would be bad to take some of that expertise out of the hands of the experts. I think being able to take that and then look downstream and say, okay, what are the implications of your expertise? I think that is what's going to be the value add and what's going to be such a cool experience. Because what I love about football is if that happens, right, the game's going to change, right? The same way that, like, teams are going for fourth downs more often, right? So then now, or teams are running too high shells more often now. And so the running game, maybe you got to run the ball more. Well, okay, well then all of our algorithms about optimizing offensive play calling are different, right? You're never going to solve football because the people who are intelligent are always going to sort of move into the different crevices that are created by the existing structures, right? So what's really cool about, our endeavors at Sumer and everybody else, working in the league is like, we're trying to solve the problem that's happening right now. And we can't wait till that's solved because it's going to create more problems that we can continue to create in the future, which is really exciting.
Well, the last comment I have on this goes back years ago. Being blessed to be in the general manager's advisory committee in the NFL for I don't know, 9 years or whatever. I would sit in there with some of the old school approaches, and they were really good football guys, and they evaluated out of their ears. They were really good. But when the topic came up about analytics, and this might have been in those early first 3 years when I was in the league as a GM, 8, 9, 10, and we would throw out that topic around our general manager advisory committee, and some of these guys who had a great deal of respect were like, Thomas, you can talk to me all you want to talk to me about that. I get it, but I want nothing to do it. I'm not going to be around long enough to be able to reap the benefits. I need to do what I need to do right now. I don't even need to think about the rising underclassmen. I need to get my roster now right. And it's amazing. There's no way that would fly now. And it's amazing. Most of those guys are out of the league, and it's a completely different world now.
Yep. And I think what's great is hopefully we'll be able to serve people who are in all walks of the life there early on, early on, people who want to sort of set a long-term vision, like they have in Chicago, where they're sort of starting over from scratch, well-established people, like they have in San Francisco, or somebody in between, like, the Vikings. We talked about him last podcast, Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah, who's, ownership kind of steered him in the direction of, hey, stay the course a little bit, generate some goodwill, and then you can sort of, build the roster in your own image. Any one of those, I think optimizations, will be able to be analyzed by us. Okay, before we go, I know we've done various levels of game predictions here. I gotta say, I love football. I think I love football as much as anybody in the world. I gotta tell you, this week's games are a little underwhelming. We got teams like the aforementioned Vikings on a bye. We have the good teams in the NFL are either not playing good teams or they're on a bye, but there is one game, and this gives me the feels. So I was back in Nebraska. That gave me the feels. The only Super Bowl game I've ever gone to was my favorite team, the Kansas City Chiefs, against the 49ers. My friend George, my former colleague, my former podcast co-host, a Niners fan, was sitting next to me during that game. We do get a rematch this week. Kansas City is going to San Francisco. Kansas City is 3-point road favorites coming off of a loss against the Bills. The best game of the season so far, I want to say. I can't wait for this game because I think you're getting two of the best offensive minds in all of football, Kyle Shanahan, Andy Reid. You get a team, the biggest contrast between two teams that you have in the league. You have a team, an offense that depends upon their quarterback more than any other offense in the league in Kansas City, and another offense, as you well know, that gives their quarterback as much to work with as it can in the San Francisco 49ers. I'm interested in your opinion on this game, Thomas.
Look, let's put it this way. I know very, very well when Kyle Shanahan came into Atlanta this past weekend and lost, there's no question that pissed him off beyond. And there's no doubt he's coming back with a fire beyond. And I just, as much as I love what Kansas City's doing, and I want to be a little bit of, I don't even know what do I call that? It's not a homer with you, but I do agree with you. Yeah. I really like Brett Veach and how he puts together the team along with Andy Reid. They have a great relationship. I'm always going to have my opportunity to talk about the team builders, but what John Lynch and what Kyle Shanahan are doing, I know it's a little bit uneasy right now. I think they come back into San Francisco. You said 3 points. Is that what you said?
Yep.
Taking San Francisco, man.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. The public, so we're not going to talk about gambling that much on the show, but the public really likes the Chiefs, meaning like everybody on TV likes the Chiefs. And I think generally speaking, if everybody on the TV likes the Chiefs and the number isn't moving, then that means that the smart people who really bet for a living are on the 49ers. And that's always the side. If you are betting, we are not. If you are betting, that is the side you want to be on. The one thing I will say, when we were at PFF and we were building betting models, when we created what was called a scheme uniqueness term, that always shined very brightly on Kyle Shanahan. And when you're a team like Kansas City that spends 75% of your downs in nickel or lighter, when you have to face a team that forces you in 50% of your downs to play 4-3 or heavier, you are just going to put players who are not used to being in conflict more often. Now, when it counted the most in 2019, the Chiefs did win. But to your point, after a week of losing to his old team in the Falcons, I don't know I think Kyle Shanahan is going to throw the kitchen sink at a Chiefs defense that includes a lot of young players, including at linebacker with Willie Gay and Nick Bolton, who are good players, but young players. And I think I do agree with you. I think San Francisco keeps this close, and a field goal. I'll take a full field goal with the Niners as well. So we agree on that one. So this has been our third episode. I think this has been our best one so far. I don't mean to tear a rotator cuff, patting ourselves on the back. But this has been great. I love the discussion and I think very poignant topics as always. We'll be back next week. I think we'll be back to our normal Wednesday time next week. But for Thomas Dimitrov, this has been Eric Eager. This is the third episode of the SumerSports Show.